Hi everybody, this is the lecture on preparing for the interview paper assignment. As you know from the syllabus, there is a paper that is due at the end of the term, and it is focused on the research method of interviewing. So, in this video, I want to prepare you for taking on that assignment. We're going to go through the handout that's already in the assignment folder, and hopefully you'll be in a good position to move forward with the assignment. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go to assignments, and as you can see, there's already a handout in there that's been there since the beginning of the term. So let's open that up, and I'll show you what we've got in here. Okay, so the handout has three parts. The first part is instructions on how to do this paper. The second part is a template, and the third part is a rubric. So I'll show you what each of those includes, all right? So this first part is the assignments. What you'll be doing for this paper is doing 3 interviews related to health, illness, and healing, identifying 3 class readings that are related in some way to what you learned in those interviews, and using those 2 sets of materials to write a paper, right? The final paper should be around 6 to 7 pages in length. I am absolutely fine with longer papers. I don't need you to limit it to 7. If when you write your first draft it's less than 6, then I'd strongly encourage you to make sure you have completed all the aspects of this assignment. I think it would be very difficult to complete this assignment thoroughly in less than 6 pages. Okay, so that's the reason for that guideline being there. Okay, so we've already talked in the second lecture, in the lecture for Unit 2, about the research methods that cultural anthropologists use, including medical anthropologists. And as I discussed in that lecture, interviewing is a really important part of the research of anthropologists. And I more specifically talked about different ways of approaching interviews, different kinds of questions that cultural anthropologists use, etc. So the starting point for this assignment is that lecture from Unit 2. Okay, so you're going to probably want to go back and look at your notes from that lecture and or watch that lecture again. Okay. All right. So what are you going to do these interviews about? That's really up to you. What I say in the handout here is that I want you to conduct 3 interviews with 3 different people on a subject of your choosing related to health, illness, and or healing. Okay. So in other words, it shouldn't just be like generally like talking to people about health. You want to pick something specific. Really general or interviews on really general topics really don't get you very deep into anything. So I want you to pick something. It can be really anything within this broad realm of health, illness, and healing. As I say on the handout, look to what we've been discussing in class. Look to the readings, etc. in class that can be kind of an inspiration for what you might choose. But then it's up to you. So I give you a whole bunch of examples here, but it's, you can use one of these or you can choose something else. So some examples, you could do something on illness histories, right? We remember the Good article where he really starts that paper from a long interview with this patient named Brian, right? So asking people about the course of an illness or the experiences across an illness. You can talk about the kinds of medications people use, pharmaceuticals, herbal medicines, etc. You can ask people about their interactions with or relationships with healers of different sorts, right? How they interact with their doctors, what kinds of treatments they've received, etc. And again, remember, this can be across any variety of medical practice. It can be within biomedicine, but it can also be herbal healers, whatever, okay? So again, think broadly about what you might do and think about something that you think is really interesting. It'll be a more interesting and a more fun assignment for you if you actually choose a subject that you like or that you want to know more about, okay? So you're going to choose one topic for the whole paper, and you're going to do all 3 interviews on that same topic, okay? So it's not 3 people, 3 different topics. It's one topic, 3 different people. Again, think about the nature of research in anthropology. We're trying to figure out what are some of the patterns that of what people do or what people think. So we want to hold that topic constant and ask a whole bunch of different people, or in this case 3, because that's kind of the scope of what we can do in this short term, all for their different experiences and perspectives on that one topic that you've chosen. Okay? Now, again, building on the lecture from Unit 2, you are going to use an unstructured, open-ended interview style. What that means is you will indeed in advance write questions that you want to ask. But it's also a little bit of a looser structure, okay? What it means is you will ask those questions, but if the conversation goes in a particular direction where it makes sense for you to come up with a follow-up question on the spot, for example, then you will do so. So in other words, you do not need to rigidly stick to the set of questions you wrote. You do want to ask those, but you can also, to some extent, follow the lead of the interviewee, right? You don't want to cut off the conversation because it's not sticking to your questions. You want to follow the conversation sort of where it goes. All right. I've given you some more specific instructions about writing those questions, really just to help you have, I don't know, some parameters to work within. So what I say is I want you to write at least 8 questions, right? It may end up being a little bit more, a little bit less in the actual interview, but start by writing 8 questions. And among those questions, I want at least one of them to be what's called a tour question. I want at least one to be what is called an experience question. And I want one to be either a native language or significance question. Again, return to the Unit 2 lecture to remind yourself about the different kinds of questions that I talked about. Basically, this is the sort of the foundational activity that you'll be doing for this particular assignment. And I want you to think about things you might want to know about your topic that you want to ask people about, right? Again, I give you a bunch of options or examples that you might use, right? You can ask people about their illnesses. You can ask people about how their family reacted to an illness, or that you could ask somebody about being the caretaker of an ill family member, right? So again, think about first, what's your subject? And then what are some interesting things you might want to know from somebody about that subject? And put together your 8 questions, okay? And again, remind yourself of the different categories of questions by going back to the Unit 2 lecture. All right, so you're going to need to, in some way, capture the information that comes out of these interviews because you're going to want to write about them in this paper, right? Again, I mentioned this or talk about this in that lecture, but you need to choose at least one method. You can absolutely record them, like do a digital recording with your phone or whatever. That's fine. You can also take notes during the interview. Some people will not want to be recorded. That's fine as well. So what I suggest is that you use at least 2 different methods, right? Like if it were me, I'd probably do a digital recording and also write down some notes along the way while I'm doing the interview, okay? Then you've sort of covered your bases. If the digital recording is not great or you miss some things, you can't hear things, or there's too much noise, or the thing doesn't work properly, then you still have your notes, right? Notes will also help you to just get an overview, right? If you just record, like digitally record an interview for an hour, all you have is this thing inside of your phone, right? So having some notes also helps you know, like, oh, this is the part that's the most interesting that I want to make sure that I carefully look at, okay? All right, so once you've completed the interviews, then the next step here is really to step back from the content of those interviews and to reflect on the interview process, right? Think about this as a method. And I give you 4 specific sets of questions that I want you to answer, right? About how it went, what worked, what didn't work, how your interactions were with your interviewees, et cetera, okay? So I'm not going to read those all off right now. These are the questions in which you're going to reflect on the interview process, okay? Then the next step is going to be connecting what you learned in your interviews to class readings. Okay, so you don't need to find a reading from outside of class. You don't need to go to the library databases, any of that. You're going to choose 3 of the things you read for this class. And again, then the challenge here is to figure out ways that they have something to do with what you learned in your interviews. Those connections that you could find, they could be ethnographic, by which I mean if somebody that you're interviewing refers to a specific kind of healing practice, and one of our readings is about that, then it could be that. It's like a topical connection. Or it could be theoretical, right? Like we've read a lot about embodiment and the body. If somebody says something in an interview that seems to reference that or to illustrate that, then that could be a way to connect it, right? So in other words, you can find a common topic between the interview and the reading, or you can find a more sort of theoretical connection, right? Like something in the reading that is not on the same topic, but it's a theory that you could apply to your own interviews, Okay, so that's the sort of, I think, most challenging part of this. Once you've collected that information from your interviewees, reflecting on how you can apply several readings from class to making sense of, analyzing, understanding better the content of the interviews that you conducted. Okay? I give you some more details here. For example, I don't need you to do formal citations in this paper, but I give you a way to sort of note which author you're talking about. So you do want to be very specific, right? It's not a sort of general connection. You want to say, my interviewee said this, or my interviewees said this, if more than one said the same thing. And this is connected to, say, the Zucker article in this way, right? Okay, great. Okay, I give you the format, right? A minimum of 6 pages, can be longer. I don't care if you write a very long paper. If you have enough stuff, right? If you have interesting things to talk about, please feel free to make it longer. I don't care about long papers. I think shorter than 6 pages will probably not have met the criteria. Okay, so then, like I said, this first part is instructions. Please read them very carefully. I know this handout is kind of long, but the reason it's long is I've given you very detailed instructions. So make sure that you follow those instructions sort of sentence by sentence, okay? So that's the first part. The second part is I'm actually giving you a template for this paper. What I mean by a template is all the different things I'm asking you to do, I've put into this sort of framework in this template, which means in terms of putting together the actual paper, you can use this to go through and sort of write out each part of it. Okay, so in other words, I'm helping you with the organization of the paper so that you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out which thing should I put where, right? So, please make use of this. It's not that you need to follow exactly the way I put it on the template, but in general, I strongly encourage you to use these categories that I put on the template as a way to sequence your paper, okay? So, for example, I say, you're going to want to start with an intro for your paper. I tell you what I think you should be putting into that introduction. Then I want you to talk about your interviews, right? So you're going to list out the questions you asked. You're going to provide detailed descriptions of your interviews. Then the next section will be writing out your answers to these questions about reflecting on interviewing. And then finally, you're going to talk about how they connect to reading. So again, this is basically like a formatted version of what I have in the instructions. So read the instructions, follow them as you do your interviews, etc. And then when it's time to write that up, please use the template to make sure you get all this stuff in there and in a sequence that makes sense, all right? And then the final section is the grading rubric, right? So just so you know sort of how I've sort of divided up the parts of the paper and how you'll be scored for each of these sections, okay? All right, well, I'll stop there. Of course, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. This is a little bit more complex assignment than the things we've done so far in this course. It's meant to sort of bring together a bunch of different things that we've done and talked about, right? You're really trying to, in this paper, synthesize some things, right? So it's both about engaging in some of these research practices that you've read about, and it's also about trying to synthesize information across the material that you've collected and across some of the readings that we've done for class, okay? So I'm hoping that this will be an opportunity to really, again, sort of think about all the course as a whole and produce something that really reflects a bunch of the different things we've worked on. So I will leave it there, and again, I'm looking forward absolutely to seeing what you do for this paper. Please let me know if you have questions. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.